Good evening. I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now. Last month, President Biden announced a plan to cancel billions of dollars in student debt for as many as 43 million people. The decision sparked some controversy and many competing claims about the student loan market. How does the market for student loans really work? Why has debt escalated so much? Was the debt cancellation program that was announced structured effectively to achieve its objectives? And what's the situation here for UW-Madison graduates? And lastly, what policies might we consider for the future? Joining us tonight are two UW experts to dig into the issues that exist in higher education financial aid and debt forgiveness. Robb is a professor and department chair in the Department of Consumer Science in the UW School of Human Ecology. And Ruhl is the Kurt and Sue Culver Professor of Economics and the co-director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy. Cliff, thank you for joining us. Your first time on the show. Kim is a defender, and we hope that you will be as well, Cliff. Great to have you with us tonight. Cliff is going to lead us off this evening, and as I noted, he's a professor of consumer science and is also the department chair in that department in the School of Human Ecology. He studies consumer financial decision-making with an emphasis on financial knowledge and capability. He's particularly interested in the financial decision-making of young adults with an emphasis on college student debt management and well-being. Robb is a past president of the American Council on Consumer Interests, from which he's received multiple awards. And he also serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Consumer Affairs. Cliff, thanks for being here. Please share your thoughts about the recent policy announcement and the student loan market more broadly.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. So I think we can start with some important context. So we can think about the student loan debt market broadly. It's roughly $1.6 trillion in debt spread over 45 million borrowers. Now, when we look at that, that feels pretty intimidating, but I want to consider how we can kind of break this population down a little bit more and start to understand where the real critical challenges are, because most of this debt is actually concentrated along among a small percentage of borrowers, and the average borrower is not necessarily overburdened or facing excessive amounts of debt. So I think it's really critical from the get-go to kind of articulate that a lot of people are not necessarily in bad shape, but there are a significant number of borrowers who are really struggling. It's probably also worth highlighting that you can have student loan debt and not actually have obtained the degree you are seeking. And while that seems really obvious, I think some people are surprised to find out that roughly a third of borrowers, based on estimates I've seen, have debt with no degree. And that can be really challenging because you end up with a heavy debt burden to bear, and you haven't even gotten the degree that is going to provide a signal to the marketplace to help you get that higher earning job or that higher earnings path. I think it's also really critical when we think about that degree and how it's valued. The long-standing notion has been that, yes, college education provides us with advantages, puts you in a situation where you can earn a higher earnings for a longer or like a steeper earnings path to make you better off over the long run. But we have seen in recent years very high inflation among college costs, which means it's more and more expensive to get that degree. And we've also seen some actual flattening in terms of wage growth in the economy. So that means we're paying more money for a degree that's maybe worth a little bit less than it used to be. So that puts us in a challenging situation that we have to look at a national level. I want to take a moment then to kind of think about this debt relief plan that the Biden administration has put forward. So this is a complex, challenging issue. There are a lot of people that would benefit under this proposal. So this plan would potentially have about roughly 20 million of the borrowers in the United States become debt-free just with this plan going forward. Now, I think what's really critical to recognize is that a big reason for this is that a high percentage of borrowers, roughly 60%, are actually Pell recipients. And under the current administration's plan, those Pell recipients have the advantage of getting $20,000 per person in relief, as long as they meet the income criteria, the 125 per person, 125,000 per year per person. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. That can have a positive impact on a lot of people's lives. But it's also really important to recognize that when we look at a policy like this, it's really important to ask the question of whether this is an efficient policy and whether it's really going to be the best approach to tackling the problem. And I would say when you look at this kind of policy, it's not terribly efficient. There's a couple problems with it. One critical problem is that this is kind of a one-time relief model, which creates uncertainty. So there's this idea that, hey, they've done it one time. Will this happen again for future generations of borrowers? What might it look like in the near future? And so it also, by creating a means test model, means that there's extra burdens from an administrative standpoint. They don't have everyone's income data to automatically do this. So there's a process of people having to file for it. Historically, there's been some issues when the federal government tries to do these widespread policies and create websites. So there's always something you're going to look at. How will this go in terms of actual implementation? And will we see a lot of challenges there? Biggest challenges to me and the biggest problems with this type of policy is it really doesn't address the core problem, which is really high costs and the need to borrow a lot of money for a lot of students. So when you don't address those kind of core issues, you're really just kind of creating this temporary solution for existing borrowers. I think it's really clear if you look historically at how things have operated, especially over the last, say, 20 years or so. Things like the private student loan forgiveness model have really been messy and have not been high functioning options. So if you think about the intention for something like private student loan forgiveness is that if individuals choose to work in professions that are viewed as service professions to society, teachers, those kind of things, that we want to go ahead and provide them with a means of relieving their debt quicker. And the general idea is that, say, 10 years of working in a service profession means you would just be relieved of any remaining debt as long as you've been making regular payments over those 10 years. A lot of these programs have not operated that efficiently. And we've seen cases where a very high number of applicants in these private student loan forgiveness programs are denied their relief. And so some of this comes from, I think, overly complicated systems where essentially the federal government is creating or generating loans, but then those loans are being handed over to private entities to service them. And those private entities don't always have the same incentives in terms of getting those loans discharged. I think there's some real interesting adjustments as well in this policy. So even just looking under the debt relief piece, there's some interesting modifications that come in terms of the income-based payment plans. So under the new policy, the new cap is only 5% of discretionary income in terms of that's the maximum payment that somebody might face under the new policy, whereas it used to be 10%. So we've cut that in half for income-based repayment plans, which I think is a positive modification. There's also provisions in there to increase Pell Grants, which I do think is a part of a real solution. So starting to look seriously at the type of aid support we're offering, especially in the form of Pell Grants, that's a positive step in this policy. And I think that's something that's a real potential long-term strategy towards making this a more manageable problem. I think one of the things we have to ask, and one of the last things I'll leave us with before handing it over to Kim, is a big question we face in looking at higher education in our country is truly the question of, do we view education as a social good or is it a private commodity? And so if we think about education as a social good, i.e., we all benefit from individuals becoming more educated. And I would argue that there's a lot of arguments to say, yes, there's a lot of positive benefits from having a larger portion of the population be highly educated. If we argue education is a social benefit, then some level of subsidization makes sense. Now, what the right level of subsidization is, that's a question we can kind of tackle. But I think that's one of our critical questions that we'll be kind of continuing with as we go forward. But I want to go ahead and hand it over to Kim to let him kind of cover his opening remarks as well.
Great. Thank you, Cliff. That was a great setup for the show this evening. We really appreciate that. Next up is Kim Ruhl. Kim's the Curtin Sue Culver Professor of Economics. He's also the co-director of the Center for Research on the Wisconsin Economy. His research focuses on international economics, models of firm heterogeneity, and national income accounting. He's currently a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a special sworn employee of the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, where he studies the ways that multinational firms produce and sell goods and services around the world. Kim, thanks for joining us again. You're a regular here, and we always look forward to your economic insights, especially on this important topic.
Great. Thanks for having me, Mike. All right, great. So a lot of what I'm going to say is going to reinforce or touch on some of the things that Cliff said. So let's jump into it and get down to the first slide. Just as a quick overview, before we go, I tend to talk fast. So let's start with what I want to say. I want to start by talking about how economists think about education, and that's as an investment. And I'm going to show you that it's an investment with a high average return. And we'll talk about some of that. Is there a student loan crisis? Cliff, I think, laid this out pretty well, which is that there are definitely people who are struggling with student loans. They tend to be a small group, and they tend to have some very predictable characteristics, in particular, what you might call non-traditional students and students attending for-profit colleges and universities. So I want to talk about that a bit today. How costly is the proposed legislation? In terms of just the debt forgiveness piece, something on the order of about $1,800 per Wisconsin adult, and that's going to look about like the average kind of state in the U.S. Then, when you start thinking about what is it that the government's trying to do, what do they think they're doing? Which is, are they somehow helping low-income borrowers? Is putting a cap of $125,000 on this, pushing this money into people who really need it? And I want to talk a little bit about the fact this really depends a lot on age, and that you're maybe not necessarily poor, but you're young. And I want to kind of make that connection. And then Cliff already touched on several of the kind of side effects of something like this. I'll say a bit more about those as well. So next slide, please. So before we jump into this, I think it's worth just taking a step back and thinking about what it is we're doing when we go to get education. And as economists, we call this stuff, we're acquiring human capital. And we use words like that, like human capital, because we think about this really very similarly to the way we think about physical capital, that students are here making an investment in the same way that a plumber buying tools or an accountant buying a computer makes them more productive. Right? These are things that are complementary to their labor effort and makes them kind of more productive. And that return is in a return in higher earnings. Right? So people who have more human capital, just like maybe people who have more physical capital, earn a higher return. And that's kind of, I think, the way to approach this question. And so then when you think about making an investment, well, there's a benefit and there's a cost, and how do those things play out against each other, right? So maybe one last thing, think about what Cliff just finished on, which is this idea that your investment, your human capital, has a sort of societal kind of spillover to it, that maybe getting a good education also makes you a better citizen or somehow makes everybody else better off. And I think there's certainly an element to that, as he said, but a lot of the return to human capital is captured by the person who has it, right? Somebody who has a degree, they get the higher earnings, not necessarily someone else in society. So there is a sort of strong component of this that says the people who are making these investments are also getting the return on these investments. Next slide, please. So how big is that return? There's different ways you can measure this. One of the kind of very convincing ones, studied by Avery and Turner, basically measures the lifetime value of college, think about the net present value of going to college compared to high school. So this is the increment over just having a high school education. And in 2010, on average, that puts it at about about $500,000, right? So that's a little higher for men, a little lower for women, but that's sort of a ballpark number. And this number has grown a lot since 1965. This number is about 3 times higher than it was in 1965. So the skill premium, the value of being college educated versus high school educated, has been growing over time. And so the return on your investment is pretty substantial if you can graduate from your institution. Average student debt is on the order of about $36,000 a person. I'll talk a little more about some of these numbers, but this has grown too, as Cliff has alluded to. That people are taking out more debt to get through college, partially because college has gotten more expensive. Part of the reason college has gotten more expensive is because college takes a lot of these skilled workers, right? A lot of people who have college degrees, and so as college degrees have, those people with college degrees have earned more, college has gotten more expensive as well. But on net, as my colleague Anant Seshadri likes to put this, he says, if a 25-year-old inherited a house worth $500,000, but it came with a $36,000 mortgage, would you feel bad for that person? And I think most of us would say no, but of course there are caveats. So next slide. So that $500,000 benefit versus $36,000 worth of loans is of course an average, and there's lots of heterogeneity there. And something that makes that your human capital a bit different than, say, a house, is that it's harder to borrow against your human capital. Right? It's the bank can't come in and foreclose on your human capital and take it away from you and sell it to somebody else. It's yours, and so that makes it harder for banks to lend against this. Right? Do you want to lend an 18-year-old, $100,000 to go to school? That might be tough for some banks to want to do, and young students or young people tend to be more credit constrained, and that's part of the role of the original government subsidies towards educational borrowing to begin with, was trying to loosen some of these constraints so that people who have this kind of positive net present value investment to make, getting a degree, can have access to financing to do it. Now, that $500,000 benefit has some variation in it. Right? It depends a lot on, and to be important, it depends a lot in some very predictable ways on the type of school you go to, the degree you get, and then some unpredictable ways on the student themselves. Right? Some people are going to kind of naturally be better at university type stuff than some others. And then, as Cliff also mentioned, and this is kind of very important and something that often gets lost, is that starting college is not the same as finishing college. Right? The return is to having the degree, to getting through the whole program, and that's a big deal. People who drop out don't get the big income gain, but they're still stuck with the loans, and that's a problem. Next slide, please. So, is there a student loan crisis? These are numbers that Cliff talked about. I just put them up here for us to take a quick look at. You can see from 2004 to 2021, the number of borrowers almost doubles. The amount of debt in real terms have deflated the 2004 numbers to put them in 2021 dollars, have about tripled. Debt per borrower has gone from about $20,000 to $36,000, $37,000 a person. And then the defaults have gone from 5% in 2021, they're 7%, but that's we're already doing some debt relief, kind of COVID debt relief. So there's been a bit less default, but in 2019, there was default rates of almost 10% or more than 10%. So, to the extent that people are worried about the student loan crisis, I would say it's that last column that's sort of interesting, and maybe the idea that the debt per student has gone up as well. Next slide, please. So who are these people who are having trouble with their debt? In a study by Looney and Yannelis, they sort of identify this group of people who are attending largely for-profit schools, and they're non-traditional students. Since they tend to be older, they tend to go part-time, and they're living on their own. These are typically adults who are going back to school or having a later start than others. And non-traditional borrowers at this point are making up almost 50% of new borrowers, and they're making up a very large set of the people who are actually in default. And so it's a bit of a change in the composition of the people who are taking out these loans, which on the one hand might be good. Maybe we want more non-traditional students taking a crack at university and getting a degree and moving up. But we have to understand that when that doesn't work, they tend to be more affected by this. Next slide. So here's an example. The University of Wisconsin-Madison is a public four-year large university. You might have heard of it. Grand Canyon University is a private for-profit four-year large university. I have heard of this because they advertise. So when I was watching football this weekend and thinking about college debt, an advertisement for Grand Canyon University was on TV. So I looked them up. Just kind of comparing the two, you see, in terms of part-time enrollment, Wisconsin, about 5% of students enroll part-time. At Grand Canyon, it's almost 70%. So this is definitely aimed towards part-time students. graduation rates are very different. The University of Wisconsin, almost 50 percentage points higher in graduating. Remember, graduating is one of the most important parts of getting something positive out of your degree. You see earnings, your median student graduating from UW makes about $25,000 more a year, but the debt levels are very similar to each other. Right? So these are people paying almost the same. Grand Canyon University is a bit more expensive. It's $20,000 a year versus $17,000 here in Madison. And then those last two columns are something about debt, of these students. And so making progress is that people are paying their loans and their balances are going down. So 37% of the cohort that was surveyed are making progress in Wisconsin versus 18, and then people who are already paid off, 23% versus 6. So you can see that certain universities, and this is the point in which I make that it's predictable. Right? This is something the government could, instead of this largely untargeted policy, the government could do a better job at kind of pointing out where the people are who probably have problematic loans and dealing with it. Next slide, please. The policy itself, I think Cliff has covered, so I'll just skip that. Next slide. And then just to give you a sense of what this looks like, some of the variation across the US, in the left panel here of the slide, on the x-axis, that's the share of adults with federal loans. So you see Wisconsin in red kind of floating around in the middle there. About 13% or so of adults in Wisconsin have a federal loan. And then if you look on the left axis there, the y-axis, that's the share with loans of less than $10,000. And so that's about, let's call that 5.5% or so. Those are the people who presumably would have all of their debt wiped out by this problem. And you can see that there's a lot of variation with, Mississippi kind of being very up in the upper right-hand corner with lots of people with small loans, and Hawaii kind of on the opposite side. And then the right-hand panel of this, it tells you something about what this costs. So again, if you pick out Wisconsin, which is in the middle and near kind of the US average, you can expect that relief per borrower, that's along the x-axis there, the average person is going to receive, a little less than $10,500 of basically loan forgiveness. And then on the left-hand side, if you imagine everybody in Wisconsin was going to pay for this in a lump sum, we would each have to kick in about $1,800 in order to fuel that. So that should give you a bit of sense of the cost. And you see DC in the upper right-hand corner, kind of some of the most expensive, the ones eligible for the most relief, and Wyoming in the bottom. Next slide. Thinking again more about who are we trying to help and are we doing a good job of doing it? So this is a non-targeted policy. And the problem, one of the issues that comes up is just that income grows over time, right? You don't graduate making the salary that you're going to make when you're 45 or 50 years old. You start with a low salary and it grows on average as you work. And so this idea that recent college graduates who are not going to be making very much today, but will be making more in the future, are eligible to relief, kind of then means we have to think a little more about the age distribution of who's going to be getting this relief. And a very nice sort of paper that's not quite done yet, but I've been able to peek at it by my colleagues Anant Seshadri and Junji Guo, show that for younger students, younger people, 18 to 45 years old, there's not a lot of difference in the sense that people with college degrees, people who are eligible to get this relief, tend to have higher incomes than those who are not eligible. Those are people who either didn't go to college or didn't take out a loan or have already paid off their loans, right? And so the relief going to younger people is more likely going to go to people with higher incomes and less likely to go to people with lower incomes. So it's not clear we're targeting the right people when we look at younger people. When we look at older people, 45 to 65, here what we're seeing is that it is kind of more likely that people with, we're going to hit people with low income here. And what we might think about there is that by the time you're 45 or 65, if you have low income, you've probably had low income your whole life, and you're probably persistently going to have lower income into the future. And so that suggests those are people that we might want to target with debt relief, and in ways we're kind of not so much doing it right now, and over subsidizing maybe younger students. Last slide. And so, yeah, Cliff mentioned this, one-time policies. Terrible ways to go about doing this. It just creates a ton of uncertainty. Everybody now is sitting around thinking, well, when is this going to happen next, right? Maybe I should take out, maybe I'm a student, I should take out an extra $10,000 worth of debt because it might be forgiven again. So this kind of arbitrariness of this creates a lot of uncertainty for students, for parents thinking about planning for college. And there's a really interesting kind of example of this that I was very familiar with, which was in 2004, there was a recession, and the Congress passed a one-time repatriation holiday on taxes. So basically, multinational companies could bring income back into the United States and pay a much lower tax. And that was just going to be a one-time thing just to get us out of the recession, and then never again. And so what happened after that was a constant stream of lobbyists talking about when the next tax holiday was going to happen. And sure enough, the next recession comes in 2008 and 2009, and a tax holiday is proposed and was lobbied for very, very, very much. In the end, it wasn't passed. So talk about uncertainty. Maybe there's going to be one, maybe there isn't. And this is exactly what I would expect to see with this kind of a policy as well. Why not try this again next election cycle? Why not try this again next time there's a recession? And this just creates kind of a lot of uncertainty. It's unnecessary. So I'll leave it at that, and then let Mike take over.
Well, thank you, Kim. As usual, great comments. And between you and Cliff, I think you've covered a lot of the central issues. One thing I do want to take up tonight, and I want to start with Cliff on this. UW-Madison is not typical as it relates to this whole student debt problem. And I would love it if Cliff would, I know you do a lot of work with enrollment management and student financial aid. It's a big part of your research. And I'd love for you to kind of set the record straight. Like, what are the facts as you understand them at UW-Madison? And this is an issue where protagonists on both sides, they cherry pick anecdotes and make their claims about what's really going on here. And, we're grateful for them because that's why our show is important. We bring people that have facts. So tell us what's going on at Madison. What are the facts here, and how big of a problem is this for us?
So while we certainly can't speak for every student, I think on average, UW-Madison really does an excellent job of providing supports. And they've put together a really nicely structured set of aid programs and packages. So they really are creating an environment in which a lower proportion of our students have to borrow large amounts. And even those that do borrow, we tend to see they're graduating with lower levels of debt than national averages. And a lower proportion of our students graduate with debt. So I think it's something like roughly 60% of graduates from UW-Madison do not have any debt upon graduation. And if you look at national statistics, it's more like 55% of students graduate with debt when you look across the national. There's less average debt per borrower, as I think Kim kind of highlighted when looking at some of the numbers earlier. And what's really interesting is that there's a really strong commitment towards meeting the need for those students that are in the highest need categories. So if you look at something, a more recent commitment by the university, something like Bucky's Tuition Promise. That Bucky's Tuition Promise promises to provide 4 years of tuition-free access to UW-Madison for Wisconsin residents who have an adjusted gross income of $60,000 or less. And that's a really powerful thing to be able to offer. They offer also, they have a web of programs that provide supports. And so Bucky's Tuition Promise is just one of many programs that I think help create an environment in which students are less stressed about the debt they might need to take on to get a degree. And we do have an institution, I think, that's kind of mindful of that and is trying to be forward thinking in providing supports for our students.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it is interesting because, one of the big costs of attendance of college is just the costs outside of tuition. Yeah. And that's something that's gone up quite a bit, but of course, if students didn't come to the university to study, it's not like they'd be living for free somewhere. So, that's an interesting angle on this whole thing. Question from Charlie Weiss: while education has a value in its own right, doesn't a university owe its students an assessment of the marketability and payback of its degree programs? And, I just want to chime in with Charlie. I've worked in universities for a long time, and it's kind of hard to find out, what is the expected income from different degree paths and why don't we share more of that information with students on the front end when they're making their choices? Cliff, I'll let you start and let Kim chime in. And
yeah, I think this is a really great question, and it goes down to like, there's, I think, a long history of questions around accountability in higher education, right? And this is one of the reasons we've seen assessment programs within universities grow, but also being able to kind of justify the high costs and say, this is what you're getting out of that process. And I think it's one of the things that, and I'll let Kim kind of develop on this a little bit more if he wants to, but I think it's really important that he highlighted the for-profit piece, because in a lot of cases, when you look at the real data, those for-profit institutions tend to have really poor records in this space, whereas a lot of your traditional universities have much better records here. And I think there's something to be said for, from a policy standpoint, creating some kind of metrics of accountability around accreditation and being able to prove X, Y, and Z. But that does sometimes become a little bit of a slippery slope of what exactly proves success in these spaces. But I think it's a very fair question. And I do think students should be able to get data to assess these things, because this is a really tricky question that people are being asked to answer. And I'll let Kim weigh in as well.
Yeah, so it's funny. I'm usually the person on here talking about how bad the government does everything. But one thing the government does really well is there's a really great website called College Scorecard. And what it does is it basically compiles data on basically any degree granting institutions. And it tells you things like, well, that's what some of those numbers were that I was citing today. What are average or median? What are median, incomes? What are median debt levels? What does it cost to go to this place? What is a graduation rate? And then it gives you some breakdown by different degrees, for example. I think that's extremely valuable. I think it's the kind of thing someone like me knows about, because I think a lot about data and about economics. I think, when I was young, when I was 18 years old, trying to figure out what to do, it didn't exist, but I never would have known it existed anyway. So some of this stuff is out there, and I consider a public service announcement that people listening to this should, even if don't have a kid getting ready to go to the university, just go look at it. It's fascinating. I can spend hours just sort of trying out different universities and looking at what's going on. And I think that and like I mentioned before, some of this stuff is predictable. So if you just look at kind of average earnings, engineering degrees, nursing degrees, computer science, economics, math, these are degrees that we know on average do very well. And music, fine arts, drama, some of these things we know tend not to do very well. And they pretty much all cost the same. When you come to the university, there's not a lot of difference between taking an engineering degree and a drama degree. And that's not to say a drama degree is a bad thing, but you should understand what you're getting yourself into, which I think was Charlie Weiss's idea, which I agree with that. And, when I used to work at a different university, and I was a part of the undergraduate degree fair, we just had a big sign that just listed the top majors and what they're in terms of income, of average earnings. And that's sort of a powerful thing for a student to see, like, oh, these are the degrees where I can, make a living, and follow your passion, sure, but it helps to get a paycheck as well. So I do think there is a real need for that, and we do owe these students that.
Yeah. I always found people's passions changed over time. There's a certain reality that sets in when you're 30 and you got a couple of kids, Yeah. So anyway, hats off to that. Another question from MS Putnam. Have reductions in UW funding by the Wisconsin State Legislature increased costs for UW students, thus creating a greater reliance on debt? Thoughts about that? Kim, do you want to start? I mean,
I'm going to start by saying I don't know as much about the inner workings of the UW system, but I am under the impression that tuition has been frozen for quite a while. So I can imagine, reductions in funding are probably hurting UW or making them have to raise money in different places, which Mike has helped us out with. To the extent it's for in-state tuitions, at least, I think that's at least given some relief there. I would also just mention that part of the reason I think why people are relying more on debt is that universities in general are getting more expensive, but it's also getting easier to get these loans. The government keeps making it easier to get these loans. And now, with the policies that they're talking about now, you'd kind of be a fool not to take these loans out. I was joking with someone that you could take your $10,000 out, stick it in the stock market, and earn a return, maybe, and then pay it back, or maybe never pay back. Maybe they'll just give you a relief, and so then we'd have a bunch of little mini hedge funds running around the University of Wisconsin, borrowing from the federal government and buying equity with it. Not a bad idea, but I don't think that's what we should be doing. I don't think it's a great use of government money. But
should we be in cryptocurrency with those investments?
No, that's a lot riskier. I was thinking about something a little more. Yeah, I can't give investment advice.
Cliff, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, just a little bit. Now, again, I'm going to also side with Kim on I do not have perfect data on the process of state legislature money and how UW is working on it. But it seems to me, just based on the data that we do see, that what UW has done in response to the shrinking money from the state legislature is kind of absorb that and be creative in other ways. So I think, whether they're pulling money from other sources, I don't think it's necessarily being something that's passed on to our students, increasing the burden for students. At least I haven't observed that. I think the tuition freeze is an excellent point to raise in there, and just the graduation rates and the debt we're seeing upon graduation has stayed fairly consistent.
I think, I'll chime in here because even though I'm the moderator, I have thoughts occasionally. Yeah. I think one thing that's happened as a result of the in-state tuition freeze and the declining state support, or frozen in nominal terms state support, is we've increased out-of-state enrollments. We've grown the freshman class considerably, and we have dramatically increased out-of-state prices. And we're not alone in doing that. So when you look nationally, what's happened is more students go out of state than previously, and they pay top dollar to go out of state. So a lot of the applicants we get from the state of Wisconsin that don't get into Wisconsin, Madison, don't go to the other schools in Wisconsin. They go out of state, public or private, and pay considerably more. And I think when you multiply that across the country, that's kind of a tuition price increase in guise. They may not be changing the rates always, but the fraction of people who are going to out-of-state publics has gone up. And, it's not unique to us, but in the end, and it's understandable. It was the only way that we could continue to keep up with costs, because as Kim points out, our human capital that we use in our business is highly educated. And, the last few years, tech firms in Silicon Valley like Google have hired, a quarter of the PhD class from Harvard or MIT to work at Google. So, it's a serious issue. Our wages are going up and we have to pay for them somehow. Question from Bill Rauerdink: why are loans a federal issue? Back in my day, student loans were issued by a local bank, no parental guarantee, just my signature. Repayments were made to my local bank for many years. Obviously banks do more credit analysis. Would that be a better way to go? And maybe we could subsidize higher ed in a different way than federal loans? What do you think about that, Cliff?
Well, I mean, certainly private student loans are still a thing, but exactly why the federal government decided ultimately to dip their toe, I think what they were attempting to do in the initial phase of getting involved in this was to create greater access to higher education. It was, again, a little bit more of this perspective of this being a public good, but also not being fully willing to just subsidize outright by saying this is cost-free to access this service. So their attempt was to kind of say, we'll give you favorable loan rates, because usually what we're seeing, right, when it's a federal student loan, you're going to get a more favorable loan structure than maybe a private loan provider would be willing to give you in terms of interest rates and the model of those loans. So that's, I think, some of the logic for why the federal government got engaged. Whether that's right or wrong is always a good point of debate. But we do still see a balance of private and federal loans. And honestly, in the current marketplace, what we're usually seeing is a federal loan first, private loan stack-on model for a lot of students. And honestly, those are the circumstances where I see the most problems in the research I look at, because it's adding those private loans that can be more variable in nature that really ends up being a stressor for households in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Kim, any thoughts on that?
No, I just add that Yeah, the model where you go to your bank and the loan officer looks you in the eye and decides whether you're a good credit risk or not that's a tough model in the sense that there's no collateral, as I sort of said earlier, right? It's you got your education and I can't take that away from you, and so that does make those harder loans to issue. And given that young people typically are credit constrained, they're really they don't really have a work history yet. They haven't done much. I think there's nothing wrong with that model. It's just you're going to probably see fewer loans, and so that was I think one of the original. This is what 1965 or so. One of the original sort of Johnson talking about this was exactly like this is a way to get loans to more people so more people can go to college, because they sort of clearly had in mind this idea that there was some public good nature to having a more educated population. Well, that's again, whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but I think that's kind of what they had in mind.
Well, brace yourselves. I'm going to come back to that issue in a minute and ask you both about whether it's public good, and if it is, how we should go about subsidizing it. What would be your preferred method? But first, Alex Bricker asks, what is determining the interest rate on my loans, and what percentage is the average? I mean, I think the average will depend on when you did your borrowing. Everybody gets the same rate on the federal loans in the cohort that they're in, but what determines that rate? And either of you?
Start with Kim.
I mean, so there's a rule. I don't know exactly what the rule is, but it's based on a standard interest rate, like the yield on a treasury bond or on the prime interest rate, then with an addition to it, right? And I actually have these numbers right in front of me. So if you were getting student loans right now, the kind of undergraduate direct loans from the government are 4.99%. So you're paying 5% on a loan right now. If you're in a graduate program, you're paying 6.5%. And then these kind of plus loans, which are loans that can be taken out by parents, are paying 7.5% right now. And so, if you're an undergraduate, 4.99, that's cheaper than a mortgage right now, and certainly much cheaper than an auto loan and a credit card loan. So these are, and they've gone up. These are higher than they were a few years ago because interest rates are going up again. That's a different UW now, but they tend to move with the market, but they're much lower than you would get most likely in a private sector. Well,
and we're also not paying interest until we graduate.
Not paying interest until you graduate, and actually, right now you're not paying interest at all, no matter who you are. Part of COVID relief has been a suspension of payments and without accruing interest while we wait. So these things.
And now part of COVID relief is your loans aren't as much as they used to be.
It could be, yeah, I guess so. There's still some work to do, but to get this pushed through. But yes. I guess until the end of the year or so, I think that there's been the final stoppage freeze on loan repayment.
So we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but let me just ask broadly. Is college too expensive today? And Kim, you certainly talked about there is an ROI. Cliff talked about, well, maybe it's not quite as great as it used to be because more people are paying more than they used to pay. And I've kind of chimed in on that. There is this tendency of more people to be going out of state because a lot of institutions like UW, they're keeping in-state prices low. They keep this, UW has got as many in-state students today as we've ever had, but we've actually grown our enrollment mainly with out-of-state at high price to make up for the fact that we have this tuition freeze. But, is college getting too expensive today? How could we contain costs? And are we subsidizing education in the right way? I mean, obviously we're subsidizing it. So there is implicitly a belief that there is some public good to a college education. But how would you subsidize it if you were in charge of it? And Cliff, you kicked it to Kim last time, so
I'll go first. Yeah. So yeah, that's a fantastically challenging question, right? So I do think something has to be considered in looking at kind of the framing of the costs here. But I'm also really flexible in my thinking about models that might be ideal. One of the challenges at a very, very large institution like ours is that it is kind of cost cutting can be really challenging, because you can look at all different ways that costs are being increased, whether that's cost of the inputs being faculty, staff, administrators, or just costs of facilities. All of those things can be really challenging. I think there's something to be said for discussions around how to create clearer access pathways, and I've been generally pretty supportive of the notion of, if you think about making something like community college access, maybe that's subsidized and low cost or free, and the intention of allowing a pathway where you can get those 2 years done there and then transition to the more costly larger institution to finish off 2 years there, but then also being really aggressive by, I think Pell Grants have been really too low for a long time. Pell Grants, I think, are a really good strategy to target those in need, but they've really been, I think, just too low for a long time, given that the costs have gone up and up and up, and Pell Grants really haven't been keeping up with that. So to me, it is a kind of a mix of policies that I would see as being beneficial here. I don't know that it's easy to attack costs directly, but I think there's ways in which you can reasonably start to think about your approach to subsidization and creating greater access at reasonable prices for individuals, and thus, again, through Pell Grants or 2 years of free access to community college and then transfer. But I'll let Kim weigh in as well, because I'm sure he has thoughts.
Sure. My thoughts are on a little bit different. There's been a lot of research that says the big public good nature of education happens at very young ages. That it's, the big thing is that you want a population who can read and write, so they can be informed voters, so that they can drive, they can file their own taxes, that sort of thing. You want people who can do basic math, and so even some research shows really the most important stuff is happening in kindergarten and pre-K and in really young ages, compared to and I'm sorry, as a college professor, it hurts me to say this, than everybody knowing calculus. That might be, perhaps there's less of a social good there than there is having a population who can read and write. So, and I think the government sort of does put a lot of, we have pre-public education typically. There's a lot of things they do for that. So, but that's not to say there's not a public good nature to having an advanced degree as well. I think that there's certainly not an argument for that, but it might be smaller than necessarily what's going on in your middle school. As far as costs and things, all of these kinds of programs, including the original ones, to subsidize this debt, to the stuff that's happening now to kind of subsidize it even more. You're just more debt that allows universities to charge higher tuitions. Say, who is this a subsidy to students or to universities? And it's hard if the government went out and got rid of $10,000 of everybody's auto loan, next month. People might go out and want to buy more cars, or Ford might start charging $4,000 more for a car, and that's certainly sort of been there. But I think when we think about the cost of college, I've already discussed skilled worker salaries. It takes a lot of skilled people to run a university, not just professors, but lots of other people who are here doing things. College, now I don't want to sound like a curmudgeon, but college has become or has gotten more so a consumption good. There's a lot of fun things that happen on college campuses. Maybe they always have, but we have very nice gyms, and we have football, and we have climbing walls, and the Memorial Union, and these are great things. And but that stuff costs money, and so not only are you getting a degree that's going to give you an extra $500,000 of earnings, you're going to have some fun kind of while you're here too. And is that what we want to be subsidizing? Is there a way to sort of peel that off separately? We're certainly not set up for that now, that the university gives you a bill for your education and a bill for for getting to stand outside Camp Randall and have fun. But some of that is certainly going on, and then this technology and the extra things that it's no longer just chalkboards and books. There's a lot that goes into educating students, and that's just kind of gotten a bit more expensive. Things have gone on.
That is a great point, Kim, and I think it's really fundamental to some things that we talk about a lot on the campus, which is making sure all students feel like they belong. And so it's kind of important, if we're going to offer these amenities, that everyone who's a student can participate in those amenities. And so the more you ramp up those amenities, and that is a bit of something that's happening on all campuses. You got to make it accessible to all, or you have other issues to deal with that are very complicated.
Just real quick, I was gonna, and it's not frivolous. This is one of the ways universities compete with each other. As students show up and say, "Let me see what the dorm looks like." What kind of what's the rec center look like?
Yeah,
and so it's not just frivolous stuff.
And we're pretty happy about that, because the new Nicholas Recreation Center and the Baki Center that's going to open within a year are going to be spectacular. So for us, that's good for the competition. But these are big ticket items. Absolutely. Some of them are paid for by student seg fees largely, but still. And it relates to a question that we got just a few minutes ago from Jim Scolaro. He wonders what percentage of tuition is spent on educating the student versus being spent on research, improving facilities, sports, outreach, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, none of us are necessarily privy to the details of that, but I will just say this: the research enterprise largely funds itself. The university brings in more money to do research than it does to do education. The facility expense, maybe the research mission of the university makes our facility expense a little bit higher, but a lot of the research grants have earmarks, in indirect costs that go to help fund that facility space. And sports at UW are really, we're one of the fortunate programs in the Power Five where our athletic program pays for itself and then some. And we're very lucky with that, but around the country that's not always true. So I don't think we could limit rising tuition costs by limiting those other activities. I think students at Wisconsin are getting an incredibly good deal if they're in-state students, and we've got a long queue of out-of-state students that want to pay that higher sticker price. That's why our applications have been growing. So,
yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that's why I kind of couch it as a better model might be in some cases students taking those 2 years at a lower cost institution if cost is really one of the key limiting factors to attendance. But I think those are really good points that Kim raised as well. And I think he also made good points around, and something that we haven't spent as much time on tonight, but something that's kind of been in the circle there, is that it really shouldn't be viewed that the college education is the pathway for everyone, right? We really are clear that not everyone needs this. It's really not a end all be all for every individual. And in some cases, it may be somewhat counterproductive for some career paths and other interests that people might have.
That's a great point, Cliff. I don't know the fraction of high school graduates that quote unquote should go to a 4-year college or university, and whether we're offering the right mix of majors for all the students that want to go on and get additional training. We have a lot of majors that get maxed out and then people have to go to something else. And I think where we get maxed out is probably the same as where many other colleges get maxed out. And I don't know if we evolve quickly enough as institutions. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I know that there was a debate in the Florida legislature about changing basically tuition subsidies or tuitions depending on what kind of degrees were needed in the state of Florida. So if the state of Florida is short on electrical engineers, then we're going to subsidize people going to get a job in electrical engineering. I don't know if that ever got anywhere, but there are people thinking about this kind of stuff. And I'm not sure that's quite the right policy that you want to necessarily subsidize. The job market is already kind of taking care of that. If there's not enough engineers, wages for engineers will go up and people will go get more engineering jobs. But thinking a bit about maybe what are the jobs that maybe have the big social benefits, right? The ones that aren't captured through high wages. Maybe those are the ones that we want to think more about trying to get people into. Overall, by subsidizing loans, we're probably pushing some people into college because we're lowering the price, to lower than the market would have put it, who are coming in and getting degrees that they probably didn't need. Except you maybe had some fun while you did it, but maybe they wouldn't have been there if we weren't kind of subsidizing prices. So I think there is something interesting to be said about that. The market kind of just earnings mechanism takes care of a lot of this, except for the cases where there are strong, kind of strong social benefits that aren't being captured by the individual.
Yeah, and I'm always a little bit wary of things that start to smack of like social engineering to a degree, where we're trying to say like this is where we want people to go.
Yeah.
And it's not a. I do think Kim makes a good point about how the market has its mechanisms to kind of direct people, but we do still see some challenges in terms of people getting degrees. I think that do end up being like feeling more like a burden, or like I wouldn't really have done that if it wasn't so easy to like facilitate the costs through loans or something.
Yeah, I think I just wonder, the open question for me is whether the higher ed sector is exposed enough to the kind of marginal economic incentives to respond when, we need a lot more engineers in the country, or we need a lot more data science people. I don't know that there's enough in it for the decision makers within the higher ed administration to make those tough choices, reallocate resources, and achieve that social objective. And so we might have fields like nursing or medicine that go a long time where maybe we don't have as many people as we think we need. But well, these are idle musings from a moderator. I don't know what those are worth. We are coming up on the top of the hour, and I just really want to thank both of you for taking your time tonight. This has been a really interesting discussion, and I think we've been able to get at the core of a lot of the issues facing higher ed. And it really is a big economic decision, as you guys pointed out tonight. And people that go to UW-Madison, for the most part, are making a great economic decision. Not that there aren't isolated cases where you couldn't end up with too much debt and maybe not the right degree to pay it back easily, but we're in pretty good shape. But it's a big national policy issue, and I know there'll be plenty of people, including you, chiming in on this as we navigate it going forward. So thanks for taking your time tonight and enlightening all of our alumni in the audience.
You bet.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right. We'll be back again at an undetermined time as we're navigating this now, but we'll find another really interesting issue and we'll come back at you. I hope you enjoyed the program tonight. And as always, on Wisconsin.
You can try, but you'll never stop a badger. Because we badgers are born with curious minds and endless heart. When we see a curve in the road, we speed up. When there are mask shortages for first responders, we make our own supply chain. When there's a world on pause, we sharpen our claws. Through thunder, fire, and pandemics, we'll keep going. Because after all, you can't stop a badger.